This week, I'm going to talk about the expressivist process pedagogy. You have readings to complete, so I'll not spend a lot of time summarizing them here. Instead, I want to talk about how expressivist pedagogy responds to the perceived literary crisis and the pedagogical imperative of the field of writing studies. I will also talk about how I've used expressivist pedagogy in my own teaching. So let's dive right in. During the 20th century, there were several expressivist movements. Early interest in Platonism in the 1920s suggested that writing might be the product of some individual's internal reality. However, the movement really began in the 1960s. Expressivism seeks to answer the question, where does the content of writing come from? Or in other words, how do we get our ideas? The dominant Enlightenment model of the current traditional paradigm suggests that ideas are the product of rational thought, and writing as a verb is the act of transcribing thought. While the notion of transcribing thought is interesting and certainly makes sense in the context of the Enlightenment, it works well only for individuals already accustomed to thinking and writing in a particular way. Early universities were for children of the elite class, and these children had most likely attended preparatory schools, which helped them develop the ways of thinking and being that were expected of them. Current traditional pedagogy presupposed this background and was woefully inadequate for students who weren't from that background. The emphasis on formal elements in that paradigm assumes that students struggle with writing because they lack a familiarity with the grammatical conventions that allow them to transcribe their thoughts. This assumption is incorrect, and expressivism responds to it. Expressivism suggests that the challenge that some students face when writing is not a lack of formal understanding of grammar, and simply teaching and marking grammar rules won't help. Instead, it suggests that these students struggle finding anything to say. In the tradition of rhetoric, they might suggest that the problem is in the canon of invention. Of course, anyone who has had writer's block knows that this is a difficult problem. I cannot simply tell a student, express yourself, and they'll do it. Expressivism is grouped in the process movement because it focuses on specific processes that help a writer find inspiration, express their true self, and find their voice. As you do the readings for this week, consider the different arguments that expressivists make for the kind of process that is useful in helping students find that voice. Also consider how they theorize or explain the nature of expression. You will find that in this paradigm and all of the others that the way that a theoretical camp conceptualizes the phenomenon of writing goes a long way to explain the specific approaches they recommend. So, teaching with expressivism. Expressivist pedagogy's strengths, I would suggest, lie in its ability to help writers get words on the page. Many students enter our classes concerned about grammar and mechanics to the extent that they are afraid to write anything. Even writers who don't have that experience often struggle to write anything because they are focusing on writing the right thing. Expressivist pedagogy encourages us to see our students as having something worthwhile to say. This is a crucial perspective for any writing teacher to have because it encourages us to be generous with our students. Beyond this, expressivist pedagogy insists that we incorporate practices in our teaching to help students generate ideas. There are many, and I'm sure you'll invent some excellent activities in your writing classes. A few things I like to do in my classes. First, I like to give students low stakes opportunities to practice expressing themselves. Frequently, the stakes associated with grades will cause students to freeze up in their writing because they're so concerned about getting a good grade. Second, I think it's valuable to create assignments that are flexible enough that students can work on what inspires them. Students all have different identities, and so if I want students to express themselves, my assignments must be flexible enough to allow them to do so. The third thing, I teach many different pre-writing activities, including formal outlining and informal mind mapping. Along with this, if there's time, it's useful to give students the opportunity to do the research before they start writing. In this way, they get to be in charge not only of how they write, but also the original research that they will be writing about. And then finally, I think it can be a useful practice to write with students, particularly for students who are terrified of writing the wrong thing or in the wrong way. I do this in a couple of ways. I like to share with my students how I write as a way of modeling the fact that all writing starts from a mess. I've worked with a few students who have had a lot of trauma associated with writing. For those students, I literally sat at the computer with them and affirmed what they were doing as they were writing. Um, I would argue that expressivist pedagogy is useful for breaking the constraints that prevent students from generating ideas in writing. While certainly it is limited because the notion of a quote true self or that individuals have the freedom to write what they want and not simply what the discourse can write through them. How however, giving students the agency, acknowledging that students have something worthwhile to say, and finally helping students develop the tools to start getting those words onto the page is an important set of lessons that we can learn from expressivist pedagogy.